John Carpenter's The Thing, read by Whisperinstoryteller. Chapter 10. The Blood Samples. Mark walked over to the others and listened to Child's sobering summary. So, the radio and the choppers and tractor have all gone, and now we're completely cut off. We should wait until spring and wait for a rescue team. No, we don't wait, interjected Mark. Somebody in this camp ain't what he appears to be. Now it could even be one or two of us. By spring, it could be all of us. Giles shrugged. So how do we know who's human? He asked. I mean, if it was an imitation, would you really know it was me? The men stared at each other with silent suspicion. So, Doc, is there some kind of test you can do? Mark asked Copper. Well, possibly yes. I've been thinking about blood serum tests. We could take a sample of each person's blood. We could mix it with uncontaminated blood. I suppose if there's a reaction, we'll know who isn't human. We've already got blood samples already in storage, added Fuchs. The men nodded and agreed to start working on the test immediately. Oh, said Mark as the men left. Keep an eye on Clark. He's being close to those dogs. The men dispersed from Mark, apart from Fuchs. Mark, asked Fuchs, we need Blair's help. He's the only one who knows about this organism. It's no good. He's too far gone, Fuchs, said Mark with an exasperated sigh. We'll just have to use the rest of his notebooks and start going through them. Not long later, the men found the blood samples that were all in storage were all leaking. They had been defrosted by someone and were now pooling on the floor from the unit. One name was on everyone's mind. Where's Clark? Asked Knowles. I'm right here, said Clark. They all turned to see him. It looks like it's been opened, then closed, then locked again. Who's got access to this? Said Mark. And they all looked at each other. I guess I'm the only one, admitted Dr. Copper. And I've got the key, asked Gary cautiously. The men were speechless. So, who else could have used it? Asked Mark. No one, quipped Gary with anger. I just give the key to Copper when he needs it. Yeah, and as soon as I'm finished, I return it right away. There's no one could have took the key from me, responded Dr. Copper. Gary thought harder. I guess somebody could have lifted it from me. Giles interjected, accusing, not believing a word of it. A few seconds later, Clark jumped on the debate, and then within seconds the men were a tangle of raised voices, pointing fingers at each other. Windows fled the scene, which raised even more suspicion. They ran after him down the corridors. Windows smashed the glass of the gun cabinet and grabbed one of the rifles. Within seconds, Gary arrived on the scene and ordered him to put it down. Windows refused, making Gary even more angry. Are you all going to listen to Gary? Windows asked the men. He could be one of those things. He eyeballed the group, who then exchanged glances between themselves. Mark tried to defuse the standoff, but Gary was determined to exert his authority. Windows backed down, seeing the steely determination in Gary's eye. He laid down the rifle on the floor in submission. Gary turned around, holding the gun to the others. They backed off cautiously. Now, I don't know about Copper, he muttered, but I give you my word that I did not go near that blood. Gary lowered the gun and placed it on the shelf. You may feel easier if somebody else was in charge, he said with a shaky voice. Norris, I can't see anyone objecting to you. Norris shook his head. He wasn't up for it. Giles interjected with an offer for leadership, but Clark moved in defiantly, raising his penknife in protest. Maybe we should find someone a little more even-tempered, whispered Mark, taking the gun and knife from Clark. No one protested Mac's bid for leadership. Chapter 11. We're gonna find out who is who. As the night crawled on, the icy, relentless wind howled around the base. Outside, the empty blood bags were placed down on the ice, where Mac blasted them with his flamethrower. He turned to the silent men who stood nearby. "Now I'm human," said Mac, "but if you were one of those things, then just attack me right now." No one moved or spoke a word. The thing doesn't want to show itself. It wants to hide inside an imitation. It will fight if it has to, but it's vulnerable out in the open. If it takes us over, then it has no more enemies. Nobody is left to kill it. Then it has won. His words feeling colder than the wind around them. "There's a storm hitting us in around 6 hours. We're gonna find out who is who." He pointed an order. "Okay, Doc, Gary, and Clark, move over there, away from the others." The men did as they were told without any protest. "Norris, you and Charles shoot him up with morphine, tie him down in the rec room and watch him. And Fuchs, you start working on a new test." Fuchs stammered in protest. But I need Doc's help." "Yeah, you don't want to drug me, Mac," agreed Dr. Copper. Mac didn't respond. Copper bellowed, "Mac, I'm not a prisoner." Mac raised the flamethrower at Copper. Copper backed off without any further comment and rejoined Clark and Gary. Inside the rec room, Norris administered the morphine to the men under Charles' watchful eye. Chapter 12. Has anyone seen Fuchs? Alone, Mac sat at his desk speaking into a mic that was attached to the flat bed tape recorder. He was making an audio diary, and he was going to hide it when he was finished, just in case no one made it. At least there was a record of events that was happening. He glanced at the shredded long johns that had been found earlier. The name tag was missing. He assumed that one of them out there was the thing, and it had ripped up their clothes upon taking them over. Who the thing had taken was anyone's guess. He ended his recording with his credential and hid the tape. Mac walked past the darkened lab where Fuchs sat alone in silence. As he entered the room, Fuchs spun around in shock. "He found anything yet?" asked Mac. Just ideas," whispered Fuchs. "If a small particle of that thing is enough to take over an entire organism, then everyone should prepare their own meals. I even suggest we just eat out of cans." Mac agreed. He left the room and didn't notice the lights fade to darkness. Was it the generator? Was it a fuse? Now alone, Fuchs grabbed the candle and heard somebody pass in the corridor outside the room. Mac had already left. He asked who it was. No one responded. He followed the figure outside, into the snow. Fuchs fired up a flare and looked around. Should he go back and tell the others? It was then that he saw some shredded clothing lying discarded in the snow. He picked them up and saw Mac's name tag on them. Around half an hour later, Mac stood in the rec room. He asked the room, "Has anybody seen Fuchs?" The men were silent. Mac added, "Someone's blew a fuse out in the lab. The lights have been out for around half an hour. We've got to find him." Max pointed to the cook and Knowles. "Come with me outside, we'll go and find him. Palmer, you and Windows check the inside." Palmer objected. He didn't want to go with Windows. He'd prefer Childs. Windows reacted and both men started arguing. Mac finally lost his temper with the men. He was tired of the endless squabbling and suspicion. He delivered a directive. Windows, you come with us. Norris, you stay here, and any of these move, you fry 'em. Anything else happens, you cut loose on the sirens. We meet back here in 20 minutes regardless. As he left, he turned around and watched who you are with, real close. Chapter 13. Someone's left the lights on. Outside, Mac, Knowles and Windows walked around the blizzard holding a flare. There was no sign of Fuchs. The storm was getting worse. They walked up to the tool shed where Mac slid open the metal grid and peered inside, calling for Blair. Blair peered upwards, looking desperate. "Have you seen Fuchs?" asked Mac. "I don't want to stay in here anymore. I want to come back inside. I hear funny things out here, Mac." I said, "Have you seen Fuchs?" "It isn't Fuchs. Look, I'm not going to harm anybody, and there's nothing wrong with me, and if there was, I'm all better now. Now, I'd like to come back inside, please. We'll see." Mac walked away. Blair shot off his chair and approached the door. He repeated with urgency, "I want to come back inside." Mac closed the metal grid on Blair mid-sentence and returned to the others. Windows had spotted something in the snow. Something charred was lying half buried in the snowdrift. He bent down to inspect. It looked like human remains, and near it was a pair of wire-framed spectacles. They had belonged to Fuchs. There was also the remains of a flare. "Maybe he tried to burn it," Windows suggested. Mac thought about it. "Or maybe he just burned himself before I could get to him." "That's great. So what are we going to do now?" said Windows desperately. "You go back inside. Tell the others we found Fuchs and we'll be back as soon as possible," said Mac. Windows turned on his heel and ran back toward the compound. Knowles looked with disbelief. He wanted to go back to the warmth of the indoors. "No, Knowles, you stay with me. We're going to my shack." "But why are we going back to your shack?" "Because when I left yesterday, I turned the lights off." Mac and Knowles looked over at the shack. They could see burning lights at the windows. Without another word, Mac and Knowles headed toward the shack. Chapter 14. Anyone messes with me and the whole camp goes. Inside, Child stood at the window of the rec room looking out at Mac's quarters. The lights were now off. The men had been out for 45 minutes, and apart from Windows, they hadn't returned. Giles decided to start barricading all the doors that accessed the outside. Norris was carrying planks of wood to start covering some of the windows when he glanced outside. He shouted for everyone to come. Outside was a lumbering figure carrying a flare who started banging on the door. Was it Mac? Or was it Knowles? The men let him in, and he collapsed on the floor covered in snow. It was Knowles. The men asked where Mac was. "I cut him loose. We were checking out his place, and I found this." He zipped open his jacket and brought out a ragged piece of clothing which contained McCready's name tag upon it. He claimed he'd found it near the incinerator. Voices erupted amongst the party. Was Mac one of those things? Paranoia broke out across the men once again, and they blamed each other, questioned where each other had been. The voices were quietened by the turning of a handle of a locked door. Was it Mac? Should they open it and confront it? They then realized that their food supplies were beyond that door. They had no choice but to open it, and they had no keys. Giles started chopping the door down. Beyond the door, they found Mac standing there. He was freezing. Icicles hung from his beard. He held a lit flare over a block of dynamite. "Anyone messes with me and the whole camp goes," he whispered. "Go on, Childs, burn me." He told the men to back off. They, including Childs, backed off. It was then in a minor scuffle that Norris fell to the floor and groaned in pain. Something was wrong. He'd stopped breathing. Chapter 15. You've got to be kidding. Windows lifted Norris onto the bed where Dr. Copper started doing some immediate chest compressions. Mac stood his ground, clutching the block of explosives. "Did it ever occur to you that someone could have placed my clothing out there?" "We don't buy that," said Childs. Dr. Copper was still frantically trying to resuscitate Norris and called for them to stop squabbling as Windows wheeled over the defibrillator. He started administering the electric shocks. Then just on his second attempt, Norris's chest opened up like a gaping mouth with huge sharp teeth. It closed on Copper's arms, severing them from his body. Copper fell to the floor screaming as Norris's corpse convulsed, tentacles quivering in the chest cavity. Mac ushered the terrified men out of the room. Upon second glance at the creature, a hideous, twisted, shapeless thing had risen from the chest and was now the height of the ceiling. On its many limbs was another head that somehow resembled Norris. MacReady erupted the flamethrower and it burned in agonizing screams. Back on the bed, Norris's original head started to pull away from its neck. The skin split open, spewing green veins and yellow blood. The head left the body and slithered down the side of the bed, unseen. Mac opened fire again, and the rest of the thing writhed in the burning flames. Norris's head was now on the floor, where a tentacle-like tongue whipped out of the mouth, and like a whipcord, it wrapped around a nearby table leg that pulled it across the room. Gary and Childs approached the doorway where Mac let them in. The creature was now surely dead, and they didn't want the camp to set alight. They doused it with extinguishers, and the flames died. On the floor, unknown to everyone, the thing that was once Norris's head was still writhing on the floor and was now sprouting legs like a huge spider. The thing had imitated many life forms, and it could draw on any one of them to survive. As the men coughed in the fumes of the carbon dioxide, the spider head attempted to quietly scuttle away to escape. It was Windows who spotted it. "You've got to be kidding." Mac turned around and his flamethrower erupted, sending the spider creature into a screaming, writhing, spinning inferno. Chapter 16. The Test. Not long later, the men gathered in the rec room. The atmosphere was tense and nerves were frayed. Mac threw a length of rope on the chair. Clark watched on and murmured, "What have you got in mind, MacReady?" "We're going to do this test," snapped Mac, clutching the flamethrower as he lifted more lengths of rope from the table and threw them to the floor. "Windows, you and Palmer tie everybody down real tight." The desperate men bickered under their breaths as they watched Windows and Palmer spring to action. Clark walked toward Mac and softly agreed. "Let's do what Mac said." "I mean, he wasted Norris pretty quick, didn't he?" Mac told Clark to stop. He was getting far too close to him. "Nobody is tying me up," said Childs defiantly. "Then I'll have to kill you," said Mac. "Then kill me," said Childs in a flat tone. Mac raised his loaded gun to Childs and stepped closer into a standoff. "I mean it," whispered Mac. Childs stared into Mac's eyes and knew he meant it. Meanwhile, Clark gripped his penknife in his hand and chose his moment to ambush Mac from behind, but Mac turned around sharply and opened fire. Clark was shot directly in the face. Moments later, Palmer tied Clark's bloodied corpse next to Dr. Copper's on the pool table. Palmer was crumbling and turned around to challenge Mac. "Finish it, Palmer." "But they're dead, Mac," Palmer answered, visibly upset. Mac was stripping the plastic from a coil of wire with a sharp blade, the copper innards now showing. "Windows," said Mac. "Tie up Palmer over there, please, with the rest of the others." Windows was distraught and, just like the others, was in a state of terror and confusion. The men were all tied to chairs as Mac presided over them with his flamethrower poised. They were silent, and the wind howled around the building. "Now we're going to draw up everyone's blood," said Mac, "because we're going to find out who is the thing." Watching Norris in there gave me an idea. Maybe every part of him was the whole. I mean, every single piece is like an individual animal with a built-in desire to protect his own life. You see, when a man bleeds, it's just tissue. The blood from the thing will try to survive. It will crawl away from a hot needle. Around 30 minutes later, the tests were about to start. Under McCready's supervision, Windows had gone around each man to take a blood sample. He was now taking the thumb of Knowles, where he sliced it with a knife. The cook winced as blood oozed into the plastic disc with his name written on it. Windows passed it to Mac, who then ordered Windows to provide his own sample that would then finish off the group. Windows took the knife and sliced into his own thumb, allowing his blood to spill into his own plastic dish where his name was scrawled. "That's good," said McCready. "Put it down there and move back." He trusted nobody. Windows did as he was told as Mac burned the copper wire on the heat from the flamethrower. And now for the tests. The men watched in a tense silence as the line of discs of blood lying for the entire group were waiting to be tested. They knew the thing could appear at any point. McCready brought down the heated wire to Windows' blood, but nothing happened. There was no reaction. Windows visibly sighed. "I guess you are okay," said Mac. He looked at the men one by one as he again heated up the wire on the flamethrower. "Now I'll tell you what I already know," he said, before dropping the hot wire in his own disc of blood. Nothing happened. Giles cursed under his breath. Next, Mac tested the blood of the two corpses from the pool table. Dr. Copper was negative. "And now, Clark," said Mac, reheating again. Everyone seemed tense. Clark had long been a suspect. Knowles turned and looked at the lumbering corpse with a bullet in his forehead, but it was to everyone's shock that it was negative. "So Clark was human after all," said Charles with more than a hint of anger. "So this now makes you a murderer, doesn't it?" Mac ignored the comment. "Palmer next." He reheated and chose Palmer's sample next. "This doesn't prove a thing," said Gary as Mac brought the hot wire to the sample. Suddenly, the thing in Palmer's blood reacted to the heat and screamed. Mac dropped the blood to the floor and watched as it started moving of its own accord. The men erupted into fearful screaming, all tied to one another, while Palmer started shaking uncontrollably. Mac attempted to fire up the flamethrower, however, it wasn't working properly. Palmer's face started to contort as his eyes bulged and protruded from their sockets. The men beside him struggled against the rope that held them in place as his face split open and he wiggled out of the rope and flew upwards to the ceiling above. Windows grabbed the other flamethrower and stood beneath to aim, but the Palmer thing dropped back down and lumbered before him. Palmer's head opened and a tentacle wrapped around Windows' neck. Both sides of Palmer's head now grew teeth, and when Windows was pulled closer, they closed around him and flung him up in the air like a rag doll. Suddenly, Mac's flamethrower erupted, and the Palmer thing was ablaze and screaming with a piercing, unearthly tone. He pushed through the wall, leaving a gaping cavity, and was out in the angry blizzard. As the Palmer thing collapsed to its knees in the snow, Mac appeared on the scene and wasted no time in throwing over a stick of dynamite in its direction. He watched as it exploded into many pieces. Inside, the thing that was once Windows was now a writhing and contorting mess of gore and limbs. Windows was being assimilated by the organism right in front of the men's eyes. Still restrained, Knowles, Childs and Gary were frantically trying to move away from it as Mac re-entered the room. Mac grabbed the flamethrower that had only been used by Windows only a few short moments ago, and the Windows thing went up in a fireball. Those terrifying screams echoed around the room. Mac retreated as he watched the thing kick its legs helplessly as the flames engulfed it, burning its flesh until it eventually stopped. Chapter 17. I don't want to spend the rest of the winter tied to this chair. There was no time for pleasantries. Mac released the uninfected men and returned to finish off the blood testing. Now they knew the test actually did reveal the thing, there were no further arguments. Knowles watched in terror as Mac dipped the hot coil in his blood sample. The room was now feeling very empty, with the body count rising by the minute. There was no reaction from the coil. His blood was negative. Knowles sat numbly, deeply relieved that he was not infected with the creature as he was untied to join Mac. Childs was next. "Okay, let's do this," Childs whispered, eyeballing Mac, who warmed the coil once again. Knowles stood nearby with the flamethrower poised as Mac dipped the hot wire in Child's blood. It was also negative. Giles wasted no time. "Get me out of here," he demanded. "Cut me loose." There was one man remaining. It was Gary, the station manager. He cut a solitary figure, now sitting alone tied to his chair, the last remaining person on site to be tested. Mac again heated the coil, flanked by Knowles with the flamethrower and Childs with a gun. All eyes were fixed on Gary with a silent suspicion. Mac lowered the glowing wire into the blood sample as the wind howled outside. It was negative. Gary was relieved, but then a flush of anger raced through his veins. He wanted to be released and not spend the remainder of the winter tied to the chair. Chapter 18. Blair has been busy. Some time later, the creeping silence in the camp was deafening. The men's thick snow coats lay hanging on pegs that they could no longer wear. Giles stood looking out of the window and out at the desolation outside. Mac stood in the doorway and broke the silence. "Giles, we're going to have to give Blair the test. If he tries to make it back here and we are not with him, burn him." Mac's expression was as grave as his command. He turned and walked away, leaving Giles to return to the window. The figure of Mac, Knowles and Gary was slowly engulfed by the whiteout as they walked across the base toward the glowing light of the tool shed where Blair had been placed. Upon reaching it, they found the door was open, but it had been bolted from the outside. They entered and there was no sign of Blair. The men were mystified. The floorboards under Mac's feet were loose and they had been tampered with. He pulled them back, revealing a strange tunnel under the room. Gary climbed down and lit a flare. It lit up the sides of the long, twisting tunnel that had been carved out of the ice. The other joined Gary as they walked along the tunnel. They called out to Blair, their voices echoing in the stillness. Down there, you couldn't even hear the blizzard. Blair has been busy out here all by himself, said Mac. They arrived at a large chamber where a huge metallic object stood. What is it? Said Gary. A ship of some kind. It looks like he's been making it, answered Mac. He stole parts from the helicopter, Gary observed as he looked closer. Where is he trying to go? Knowles asked the others. Any place but here, chimed Mac. Chapter 19. Blackout in the Whiteout. Meanwhile, back in the camp, someone or something walked along the empty, lifeless corridors in the eerie silence. It approached the open door. Back in the tool shed, Mac and Gary climbed back up the tunnel and were now back in the room where Blair had been kept. They tied together sticks of dynamite. Noel stood at the door with the tool shed looking out at the blizzard. He then saw a blurry figure appear at the main entrance of the camp, then leave. Knowles told Gary and Mac believed it was Childs, who had been back inside keeping watch. Then what is he doing outside? Gary asked. No one had an answer. Just then the camp power was cut off. The entire place was descended into pitch blackness. Mac took a flare and delivered the grim news. It got back inside and blew the generator. In 6 hours it will be 100 below in here. But that's suicide, added Gary. Not for that thing. It wants to freeze now. It's got no way out of here. It just wants to go back to sleep in the cold until a rescue team finds it. Gary and Noel stared at each other, looking for a solution. Look, whether we make it or not, we can't let it freeze again. Maybe we should just warm things around here. If we're not getting out alive, neither is that thing. Mac lit the sticks of explosive and dropped them down the tunnel toward the strange metallic ship. They took cover, and seconds later there was a huge explosion. Chapter 20. Let's just wait here a while and see what happens. Then a snowplow ripped through the wall into the camp. They then hacked into the fuel tank, spewing petrol all over the floor. The men went from room to room, setting fire to the camp. There was a series of explosions as the place they called home was now an inferno of smoke and flames. Explosions ripped through the walls and rooms, exposing it to the harsh elements. They entered the generator room and descended the stairs. The place was carnage. Someone had already been there. The generator is gone, said Gary, peering into the darkness. Can we fix it? Asked McCready. I mean, it's actually gone. The men planned to bring the whole place down to the ice, leaving the thing with nowhere to hide. They set to work in silence, laying explosives in the torchlight. Gary turned a corner away from the others. His torch began to flicker. The batteries were probably running low. He didn't see the figure of Blair appear, and he didn't have time to defend himself when he attacked. Blair's fingers poked through under the skin of Gary's cheeks as something hideous grew and protruded down into his mouth. Gary died without hardly a sound. Nearby, Mac and Knowles were oblivious and worked in silence. They didn't see the thing disguised as Blair pull the lifeless Gary away down the corridor. Eventually, it was Knowles who went looking for Gary. He wandered down the labyrinthine corridors of the generator room and noticed that Gary wasn't there. He shone his torchlight into the area, feeling very uneasy. "How's it coming down there?" shouted McCready. But then Mac realized that something was wrong. No one was answering him. The place was deadly silent. He wandered down the corridor where Knowles had just been seconds earlier and lit an explosive and felt himself ready to act. Just then something below the ground bulged upwards and raced towards McCready. He dived to the ground, dropping the explosive. Something unspeakable shot from the icy ground. It had tentacles and towered above McCready. It was a shapeless, slithering mess of contorted parts that resembled dog and human. McCready reached for the dynamite and took a dive away from the thing. He turned and watched it open up and continue to morph around the many life forms it had imitated. He flung the lit dynamite and ran as fast as he could. A huge fireball from the camp lit the night sky for many miles. The agonizing screams from the thing could be heard equally as far. Each explosion lit the others that had been placed in the generator room beneath the camp. Then, at last, the series of explosions finally ended, and only the smoke and flames remained. There was nothing left of the camp, but McCready stumbled around the rubble. He was already starting to feel the cold seeping into his bones. There was a commotion, and he turned to see Childs standing nearby. "Are you the only one that's made it?" Childs asked McCready. "I'm not the only one," he said, looking up at Childs. "Did you kill it?" pressed Childs. "Where were you?" McCready asked, suspiciously recalling the man had just disappeared when they'd gone to inspect the tool shed earlier. "I thought I saw Blair," Childs responded. "I went after him." McCready laughed hopelessly as Childs sat down beside him, commenting that the flames around them would soon die. "So will we," said McCready, ice already forming on his beard. "How will we make it?" asked Childs. "Maybe we shouldn't," replied McCready. The men agreed that if one of them was the thing, there wasn't much that they could do about it. McCready broke a long silence. "Let's just wait here for a while and see what happens." He passed a bottle of his Jim Beam Scotch whiskey over to Childs, who accepted it. He took a long, deep swig, feeling the heat radiate in his chest. It was the only thing that would keep him warm. While it lasted.